This excellent conference. It's titled Ethics, Resources and Peace, Religious and Military Perspectives. We will have the opportunity to listen to four distinguished experts in the field. The presentations will be approximately 20 minutes long, and this will allow time for discussion afterwards. Let me introduce our first speaker, John Mark MATTOX, a professor at the National War College, National Defense University, Washington, D.C. Professor MATTOX combines his field experience with academic research. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel and a veteran of the First Gulf War, but he's also the author of Augustine and the Theory of Just War. His lecture will be a theoretical introduction to our panel, as it will focus on the theological and philosophical foundations of a natural resource allocation. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As I express my sincere appreciation for the invitation to participate with you today and in your distinguished company, may I also note that I alone am responsible for the views that I express and that they in no way purport to express the views of my employer, the United States government. I should also note that during my remarks, I shall touch on some themes that have been introduced to us so masterfully by His Eminence. And in so doing, may I say we must not apologize for repetition, because when we hear sacred things repeated, that means that we should take notice of how important they are. As the Apostle Paul reminds us, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established. And so it is my honor to share the witness that we have already heard born today. This important conference rightly directs our focus to today's pressing challenges. However, I would invite us to take a step back for a moment to examine first principles, the verities of both human history and salvation history that point to the need for this conference in the first instance. I welcome the opportunity to undertake this investigation with colleagues who are not only thoughtful persons, but also who are persons of faith, who regard matters of spiritual import on an equal and complementary plane with the temporal. My thesis is that solving a major problem becomes much harder when we focus only on techniques, the intermediate ways and means, while simultaneously losing sight of the circumstances that gave rise to the problem. When those circumstances are correctly understood, one can then identify the principles whose violation is likely the source of the problem. Fortunately, sacred scripture and the voices of divines throughout history provide invaluable insights with respect to both originating circumstances and the principles governing natural resource allocation. Imagine, if you will, a world in which the human population and resources are evenly distributed in unlimited abundance, and in which the climate is uniformly temperate. In such a world, would all the problems of competition over resources or of resource allocation disappear? Perhaps. In reality, however, such a world has not existed since the fall of man. In the paradise of Eden, the first parents of the human family were given dominion, we are told, over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. They were additionally given every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed. Everything was provided to our first parents in limitless abundance. The only exception to this grant of unfettered access to every created thing was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And even then, access was limited only by divine command and not by physical restraint. While the abbreviated account available to us of this primeval period does not fully illuminate the reasons for this divinely appointed arrangement, it is impossible to imagine that the omniscient creator of all things did not fully anticipate what would follow from the arrangement. Ultimately, the choice of Adam and Eve to partake of the forbidden fruit drastically altered the availability of resources. Not only would our first parents be expelled from their condition of unlimited resources, but the very nature of the earth itself would change. It would bring forth thorns and thistles, which would encumber ground, which humans would have to till to eke out a substantially less comfortable existence. Whereas the climate had not seemed to be an issue in paradise, now it was. At this juncture, humankind found itself in a competition of sorts with the earth. Benefiting from the earth's resources would no longer happen spontaneously. Rather, humankind would have to labor by the sweat of their faces to extract its wealth. Thus it is that in the first generation of the human family, the extraction and hence the allocation of natural resources begins. In the second generation of the human family, resource competition begins between two sons of Adam and Eve. Cain, a tiller of the ground, murders his brother Abel, a keeper of sheep, to seize his brother's flock. This is a remarkably illustrative story. It is impossible to imagine that Cain had no access to sheep other than those which the murder of his brother Abel would afford him, just as it is impossible to imagine that Abel could have had no access to the fruit of the ground other than that cultivated by Cain. And yet, Cain effectively goes to war against Abel for the latter's resources. In so doing, we encounter a prime example of what St. Augustine will later call libido dominandi, the lust for domination and control. This identification raises two important questions directly pertinent to our present inquiry, and which focus us on the word dominandi. The first question is, what exactly is sought to be dominated? And the second is, why? Let us examine both of these questions in turn. In the most general terms, the thing sought to be dominated is resources. In fact, it would not be a great stretch to say that all war is fundamentally a contest over resources. Those resources can come in a variety of forms. The first is terrestrial, maritime, or atmospheric territory itself. And ominously, territory now includes outer space and cyberspace. That territory may serve as a buffer from invasion, but it may also serve as a source of those things upon which a nation or state has built or seeks to build an economy, keeping in mind that the fundamental rule of economics focuses on the ability to control and allocate things whose supply is less than the demand for that thing. However, it can also be for the control of human resources, as humans are the vehicles by which artificial production and wealth generation occurs. In any case, the aim is ultimately to dominate. Now, let us turn to the second question. Why, at the most fundamental level, do human beings seek to dominate resources? To answer that question requires that we change our focus from the word dominandi to the word libido. The desire, or more frankly stated, the lust to dominate or control resources is always prompted by the prideful desire to gain advantage. This is true on the individual level as well as on the state or national level. It is also true regardless of the relative need of those involved. For example, one can easily imagine a starving person who is willing to do whatever is necessary to acquire food, no matter what the cost, including the loss of his or her or another's life. In fact, it is the regularity of this kind of behavior that makes so prominent those accounts of moral saints who, although in similar need, are willing to impart freely of their substance. However, the Cains of the world, for whom there is neither obvious nor pressing need, endlessly repeat, generation after generation, Cain's exploitation of the Abels of the world for personal gain. The same is true of nations and states. It will come as no surprise to this audience that nations feeling desperate for the necessities of life, for example, access to water for drinking or for agriculture, are willing to go to great lengths up to and including armed conflict to procure their needs. Contemporary examples include conflicts we witness around the Nile River, the Indus River Basin, the Tigris-Euphrates River, and even the Colorado River Basin within the United States. Sacred history is not without similar examples, and His Eminence pointed us to one such example. No sooner than the Old Testament patriarch Isaac redigs wells which had been originally dug by his father Abraham, but had fallen into disuse, than local herdsmen claimed the water and caused Isaac's repeated dislocation. We should note, at least in passing, that Isaac's willingness to dislocate and not cling tenaciously to his claim of ownership of the wells appears to have met with divine approval. Perhaps one may find herein anticipation of the words of Jesus that, "If any man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also." That is not to say, of course, that one is never justified in protesting the denial of self-sustaining resources. It is, however, to acknowledge that spiritually sensitive persons understand that, as Jesus put it, a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. This identification of the role of libido dominandi in resource allocation is of central importance for our present purposes. As Paul Krauss observes, quote, "The ramification of the libido dominandi is ultimately objectification. Man begins objectifying others and the world as an object to control and be controlled. Johann Fichte and Georg Helga used the language of the other. Karl Marx used the language of commodification. Herbert Kellman uses the language of depersonalization. Martha Nussbaum calls it instrumentalization. Across the history of philosophy, you find this attempt to explain the objectification of others, but Augustine was the first to pinpoint his finger on this problem, and all others are in his shadow in dealing with the phenomenon of objectification," end quote. So what is happening here? It is that human beings themselves are being stripped of their humanity. In the rush to control resources, to include other human beings, the humans themselves become objectified along with the land, water, minerals, and animal life which the Creator appointed for the blessing of the whole human family. In short, some members of the family amass natural resources at the expense of all others. It is no wonder then that Pope Leo XIV, an Augustinian of our own day, would open his pontificate with the observation, also noted by His Eminence, that the discord presently evident in the world is characterized not only by hatred, violence, prejudice, and the fear of difference, but also by an economic paradigm that exploits the earth's resources and marginalizes the poorest. Perhaps the greatest service that educators and religious leaders can offer is to confront the root cause of this issue in a world clouded by confusion. The root problem with natural resource acquisition and allocation is not the fact of acquisition or of allocation itself. It is also not, surprising as it may seem, acquisition for the purposes of conspicuous consumption, which the wealthier segments of the world view as essential for driving their economic engines. Nor is the root problem the quest for so-called security, which is itself driven by the desire to possess and control resources. Nor is it even the quest for social justice. Rather, the root problem is libido dominandi, as seen in the desire to possess and control resources at the expense of all other considerations. Because of this, we should be wary of political schemes aimed at the wholesale redistribution of wealth. The world which we were asked to imagine at the outset of these remarks, in which everything is equally available to all, is, as long as the present state of human affairs obtains, just that, imaginary. And every one of the utopian schemes of the 20th century, which promised equal or even equitable distribution of resources among its practitioners, ended in abysmal failure. Several such schemes perished in a world war, and others perished in the Cold War. Does this warning mean that we should ignore the suffering of those deprived of legitimate access to natural resources? Of course not. For the same Redeemer whose saving mission was occasioned by the fall of man, and who taught, "Ye will have the poor with you always," also taught that with the sole exception of the commandment to love God with all one's heart, might, mind, and strength, the greatest law given to humankind is to love one's neighbor as oneself. And that love of neighbor absolutely requires seeing to their basic welfare, which, in practical terms, includes access to essential resources, even when doing so sometimes requires the denial of one's own gratification. This responsibility is fundamental to the gospel and the goal to which we must aim toward. The point is that this aim avoids both the extremes of utopian nonsense and of doing nothing at all. Hence, as we journey toward this gospel-informed aim, we must do so with the realization that the question of the allocation of natural resources is not fundamentally about governments, armies, navies, and corporations. It is about individual human beings who, much to the surprise and even the consternation of the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers at Athens, the Apostle Paul describes as the offspring of God himself. In this vein, note the admonition of Pope Francis in his message greeting the 57th World Day of Peace on January 1st of this year. Quote, "The cultural and structural change needed to surmount the current crisis of resource indebtedness will come about when we finally recognize that we are all sons and daughters of the one Father, that we are all in his debt, but also that we need one another in a spirit of shared and diversified responsibility. We then will be able to rediscover once and for all that we need one another and are indebted to one another." Armed with that perspective, we can then be clear-eyed about two things we need to do. First, we need to reconcile ourselves to the lengthy and difficult task at which we will at best engage imperfectly and at which, without divine assistance, we shall surely fail, to teach wherever our influence can be felt, each person, economically advantaged or not, to live intentionally, aware of the universal tendency of fallen man toward libido dominandi, and to seek the interest of the other, sometimes, perhaps in many cases, at the expense of the self. Second, we must teach the true foundation upon which the matter of resource allocation rests. That foundation lies not in the pronouncement of international legislative bodies, and certainly not in the dictum that Thucydides reports from the Malian dialogue in his History of the Peloponnesian Wars, that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. It lies rather with the understanding that resources over which we witness so much strife, which strife in some instances we encourage by our own insistence upon sustaining lifestyle rather than upon sustaining life, do not belong to us. As the ancient psalmist put it, in words that constitute a touchstone for any true understanding of resource allocation, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein." All natural resources and all members of the human family belong not to us, but to him. As one modern divine with prophetic vision taught over a century ago, quote, We are here on God's earth. We breathe His air. We behold His sunlight. We eat His food. We wear His clothing. He has provided all the elements by which we are clothed and fed and live and move and have our being in the world, end quote. That focus and understanding changes everything with respect to the questions of resource acquisition and allocation. May I close now with a frequently retold story from the mid-20th century in which a father was trying to read the newspaper, but his little son kept pestering him. Finally, the father grew tired of this, and tearing a page from the newspaper, one that bore a map of the world, cut it into many little pieces and handed them to his son. "Right, now you've got something to do," the father said. "I've given you a map of the world, and I want to see if you can put it back together correctly." The father resumed his reading, hoping that the task would keep the child occupied for the rest of the day. However, a quarter of an hour later, the boy returned with the completed map. "Has your mother been teaching you geography?" asked the father in astonishment. The boy replied, "I don't even know what geography is." But there was a photo of a man on the other side of the page. So I put the man back together, and I found that I had put the world back together too. That aptly summarizes our task. As unsatisfying as it may sound, when immediate results are desired, let us consider that insistence on immediate universal results is itself a form of libido dominandi, and instead, as persons in positions to teach and influence, focus our efforts on inculcating proper attitudes toward the allocation of natural resources. International laws, conventions, or judicial pronouncements are never the starting point. They are merely codifications of understandings already achieved at a far more fundamental level. And it is at that level, the level of the individual human hearts, on which our unremitting efforts must focus. Thank you.